line breaks, the poetic line. Even more than rhyme, meter, the line break distinguishes poetry from prose. In fact, you can have poetry without rhyme, you can have poetry without meter, but in almost all cases, you can't have poetry without line breaks. There is, of course, the prose poem, which is a hybrid of poetry and prose, but we'll not talk about that right at this moment. When you're writing prose, you think in the unit of the sentence. And when you get to the end of the page, or when the writing simply goes back to the left margin arbitrarily, wherever the break in the sentence occurs is at the end of the page. And the writing picks up again at the beginning on the left side of the page, simply because that's where the language falls on the page. The period is what stops the sentence, not the break at the end of the page. Whereas in poetry, the line is the primary unit, and the line breaks where the poet wants it to. A line can break in the middle of a sentence. A line can break at the end of a sentence. A line can break anywhere. The poet decides when to break the line, when to stop the flow of words at the end of the page, and to start on the left-hand side again, according to all sorts of aesthetic principles that are in play in the poem. So when you see on a page language in which the sentences break in places other than maybe the end of the page, and certainly places other than at the period, then you know you're looking at poetry. So how do line breaks work? Well, there are different kinds of poetry which suggest different kinds of line breaks. If you are writing in a set metrical pattern, say you're writing in blank verse, which is iambic pentameter, or 5 feet in a line, each foot going da-da, da-da. Say you're writing in blank verse with each line in an iambic pentameter, unrhymed. Milton wrote in blank verse for Paradise Lost. William Wordsworth wrote in blank verse for his long poem, The Prelude. Say you're writing in blank verse, well, when will you break your line? You'll break it at the end of 10 syllables. It's that simple. Say you are writing in the Protestant hymn stanza that Emily Dickinson likes so much. You have iambic tetrameter, 4 iambic feet, followed by iambic trimeter, 3 iambic feet. And you will stop your line when you get in the first line to 8 syllables. And you will stop your line in the second line when you get to 6 syllables, and so on. Now, when you're writing free verse and you do not have a set metrical pattern, a set number of feet or accents or syllables that you want in your line, you can break your line wherever you want to. There's a lot more freedom in free verse for where you break your line. And certainly those choices give the writer of a free verse poem a lot more latitude than the writer of a poem in a set metrical pattern. Now, whether you're writing in a set metrical pattern or whether you're writing in free verse, you have basically 2 options for how you're going to end your lines. You can use an end stop line, which means at the end of the line you use a period or a semicolon or a colon or a comma. The end stop line really encourages us to stop, slow down at the end of the line before we start the other line. So the end stop line really highlights each particular line as a contained unit, and you move to the next line to get another self-contained unit, if that next line, of course, is end stop as well. Sometimes poets, whether they're writing in free verse or a set metrical pattern, don't want an end stop line, so they simply don't put any punctuation at the end of the line, and therefore the end of one line kind of spills over into the beginning of another line, and this is known as enjambment. And this invites the reader to read more quickly. The pause at the end of the line would not be as long before you get to the beginning of the other line as it would be if you were using an end stop line. So those are the basic ways that lines get paced at the end, and those are the basic ways that lines are decided upon in terms of their length. Now let's talk a little bit more specifically about lines. So why line breaks? Well, first of all, the line break controls the pace of a poem. If you have in-stop lines, then you're going to read more slowly than if you have a lot of in-jammed lines. So speed has a lot to do with line breaks. If you have a lot of enjambment, you're going to read more quickly. You're going to pause just a tiny bit at the end of each line, but then you're going to push on through to the next line. If you have in-stop lines, then you're going to pause more, and there'll be more of a gap. There'll be a slower pace of reading. Now, if you're writing free verse and can break your lines anywhere you want, you can have long lines or you can have short lines. A longer line in free verse is likely to lead to a slower reading pace, and a shorter line is likely to lead to a faster reading pace. Now, the poet will decide what pace the poem needs based on what the poem's about. If the poem is describing, let's say, a very fleeting phenomenon in the natural world, say a waterfall or a butterfly or a hummingbird, and the poet wants to capture that movement, writing free verse, the poet might use fairly short lines throughout, which would encourage a very quick read. But if the poet, again writing free verse, is perhaps writing a more meditative poem, maybe meditating on a heavy life experience like death or loss, the poet might want to slow the reader down, and therefore the poet might want to use longer lines that encourage a slower reading pace. Now, a second reason that I think another way that line breaks function in the meaning of a poem, pace I just talked about, but also the poet can generate tension, opposition through line breaks. Say the poet wants the poem to be fast in some places, slow in other places. Then that poet might use in-stop lines to kind of set a slow pace early in the poem, where the reader stops at the end of each line before starting at the beginning of the next. And then maybe the poet wants to reverse that or oppose that slowness by breaking into jammed lines, which would give the poem a kind of speed. So you can really get a kind of back and forth play between fastness and slowness, kind of contemplation and quickness, we might say, by contrasting in-stop lines and in-jammed lines. Or if you're writing a free verse poem, say contrasting long lines and short lines. So pace would be a main function of the line, and connected to pace would be the poet manipulating pace to create opposition, reversal in a given poem. A third function of the poetic line would be surprise, drama. You might have a poetic line that ends, say, with the reader having an expectation of what's going to come next. And then the poet decides to start the next line with something quite unexpected. So you can imagine a poet saying, well, we went out last night, and we might expect, given what the poem says, to eat. We went out last night to eat. That's what we might expect. And this is a still silly example, but it makes sense. We went out last night to eat. But what if the poet said, we went out last night and we tripped and fell down in the graveyard? Well, we didn't expect that to come. So the poet can use the end of a line as a kind of cliffhanger, let's say, setting up an expectation given the syntax or given the meaning of the poem, and then the poet might come in with something rather shocking and strange to begin the next line. And that can create a kind of drama in the poem as well, and it can create surprise effects. So those are those are three basic ways that line breaks can function in a poem. There are other ways. I mean, line breaks are so fascinating and complicated and wonderful once you really start thinking about them. I think a lot of us probably in reading poems take the line breaks for granted and don't think about them that much. But the older I get, the more I see the line break is really the most exciting part of thinking about a poem. So what I want to do now is talk about a particular poem, short poem by the 20th century American poet Frank O'Hara. A very short poem which does really fascinating things with line breaks. Now, I'm sure there's a way in terms of computer technology that I could somehow make my face go away and flash up a page with this poem on it, but I don't know how to do that. So I've decided to do something I think Frank O'Hara, who's a very whimsical poet, would very much appreciate. And that is, I'm simply going to show you the poem. Here we go. I want to get it just right. There we go. You see it? Oh, there we go. Frank O'Hara. And the poem is called Today. Today. Can you see that? Ah, there we go. Today. So you can read along with me. Oh, kangaroos, sequins, chocolate sodas. You really are beautiful. Pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins. All the stuff they've always talked about still makes a poem a surprise. These things are with us every day, even on beachheads and beers. They do have meaning. They're strong as rocks. Now, the title itself, Today, gives us a hint for how to think about the poem. Today, it's a poem very much about the present moment. Now, the poem's about the now. So any given today would be the present. So we need to think about the presentness of the poem, how it's very attuned to the immediate, the direct. And the explanation remarks betray a kind of excitement that this poet has toward today. Oh, now, if you're writing in the 19th century, you can start a line with oh or ah, and people wouldn't think twice. But if you're writing in the 20th century, that oh, it's almost whimsical. It's almost like it's almost kind of campy, like oh. So we can't take the poet that seriously. It's a kind of whimsical poem, is what I'm saying. And then we have these lists of highly unlike things: kangaroos, sequins, chocolate sodas. Well, I bet you haven't thought of those three things in connection before, ever. So already the poet is inviting us to think about how unlike things might connect to each other. And this is exciting. So we have two exclamation points. So the first line is an end-stop line. We end with punctuation, albeit an exclamation point. We do stop. Oh, kangaroos, sequins, chocolate sodas. We slow down. And then the next line, you really are beautiful. Now, I would expect that second line to break after the exclamation point. That seems to be a place where a natural pause is anyway. So we wonder, why does O'Hara not break after that exclamation point after beautiful? It seems like a very logical end-stop line. Well, he flows over and puts in pearls with a comma, which is a kind of end-stop. And this begins another strange list. Pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins. What? Pearls, jewelry, harmonicas, you play music with them. Jujubes is the little fruit lozenge. Aspirins, take them for headaches. What do these have to do with each other? What do kangaroos, sequins, chocolate sodas have to do with each other? So there's, again, a kind of whimsy to this poem, a kind of charming randomness to this poem. But also there's a kind of excess of energy. And so I think that O'Hara doesn't stop at beautiful exclamation point, because there's a sense that there's an overflow of energy here, an overflow of whimsy and charm. So it's like he wants to get to the next line as quickly as possible. So he's kind of dramatizing. You really are beautiful. Pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, aspirin. So normally we would read it as, you really are beautiful. Pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins. But the excitement of this speaker encourages him not to stop there. You really are beautiful. Pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins. And it is the same thing in line 3, where we would expect to stop at the exclamation point after aspirins. We expect an end stop there. Harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins. All the stuff they've always talked about. But again, there's that excitement that the poet doesn't want even to wait to get to the next line. Harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins, all the stuff they've always talked about. So you see how O'Hara is playing around with the expectations we would have in terms of the pacing of the poem. There's a quickness to the poem that feels almost too quick. It's a highly excited speaker here, using all kinds of exclamation marks and not even slowing down at the end of the exclamation marks. But then we get a break in stanza, which really slows us down. But interestingly, the stanza break is actually a break in an enjambment. About is, and I should say, all is also an enjambment. The end of line 3 is also an enjambment. We don't have any punctuation at the end of all. All the stuff they've always talked about. And we have enjambment over into still makes a poem a surprise. So that's an interesting tension between, all right, I'm going to slow down a little bit. Whew, I got to slow down. I'll give you a stanza break. So excited, got to calm down. But then there's not really that much calm, because the enjambment forces us to go to that next line at the beginning of the second stanza very quickly. And then we get another exclamation point end stop at the end of the 5th line. Now, the casual nature of the poem is added to by the word stuff and the general pronoun they. You would rarely see a poet use the word stuff. It's about the vaguest word you can use to describe things. Oh, it's a lot of stuff. That's so vague, it doesn't mean anything. But that's how we talk in our daily talk. When we're not trying to be overly articulate or artistic, we use words like stuff and things. And we use vague pronouns too. Who is this they? They've always talked about kangaroos, sequins, chocolate sodas. They've always talked about pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, and aspirins. Who are these people? But in general talk, we say it all the time. Like, what do they say? What do they say about X? What do they say about Y? You know what they say. Again, it's kind of a casual speech. But also, I think, ironically, it's the poet's effort to give his bizarre list some kind of authority. Like, well, people do talk about these things as if they go together, when really they don't go together at all. But it's almost like he's trying to justify his random lists by saying, well, there is a group of people who believe these things go together. So again, it's a comical poem. Moving on. These things, again, a very vague word hinting at the casualness. And there's a contrast, I should say, between the highly specific lists and the highly abstract words the poet uses to refer to the lists. Stuff. Things. These things are with us every day. What things? Well, kangaroo sequins, pearls, and whatnot. They're with us every day. Now we have another enjambed ending. So there's a little speed here, but finally the exclamation marks are gone. So we slow down a little bit from the first stanza, but still we don't have an end stop at the end of day. So there's a little speed, but not like earlier. These things are with us every day, even on beachheads and beers. So where are these things? They're everywhere. They can be at funerals and they can be on beachheads. So there's a kind of ubiquitousness to the strange things that make up poems. What makes up poems? Surprising lists, surprising connections. So this poem is what it's about. It's a poem that celebrates how random lists, random connections can make for unexpected, unpredictable, excited poems. And the idea that you can find poems anywhere. You can find them on beachheads and you can find them in funerals. So it's really a poem about poetry. A poem about poetry as a kind of extremely excited embrace of what's going on in your head right that moment. That cannot be contained by end-stopped lines. It can't be contained by punctuation. But yet there's a desire for, in the poem anyway, some structure. So we have some punctuation and we have a stanza break. So there's really a tension in the poem between randomness and control, and the line breaks and the stanza break bring that across. These things are with us every day, even on beachheads and beers. They do have meaning. Another enjambment. They do have meaning. So again, there's still a quickness because we don't have end stops, but lacking the exclamation points, we're likely to read more slowly than we read the first stanza. They do have a meaning. Now that's an interesting line there. They do. There's a real emphasis there on do. Oftentimes the first letters of a line, we tend to emphasize, the first words of a line, we tend to emphasize more than, say, a middle word. We tend to emphasize the first words and last words. So they do have meaning. It's almost like this poet's trying to convince himself. Why wouldn't he just say they have meaning? Well, that would suggest a kind of surety, a kind of confidence. They have meaning. But they do have meaning. It really suggests that he's trying to convince himself that all these things that he's listed have some kind of meaning. And not only can you find them on beachheads and beers, but they might actually give beachheads and beers meaning. So again, a tension shows up in the poem between this desire for whimsy, who cares what comes next? Chocolate, aspirin, who cares? But also this desire for, well, maybe we should care. Maybe there is structure and maybe there is meaning to these random lists. And the line break that forces us, or encourages us, I should say, to hit the word do a little harder than if it came another place in the line, emphasizes again this poet trying to convince himself they're strong as rocks. So the last line has what we would call a caesura. A caesura is a pause in the middle of a line, and that pause can also be marked by a period. So that stops us a little bit even in the middle of the line. So this last line really slows us down. And given the quickness of the first stanza, it is a counterpoint, but also it's almost like the poet's calming down and trying to meditate on this crazed opening and trying to ask himself, do all these random things and their relationships, are they meaningful? Yes, they are. And they're strong as rocks. So contrast rocks to kangaroos, sequins, chocolate sodas, pearls, harmonicas, jujubes, aspirins. I mean, you get the feeling the poet could go on and on and on and on with these crazy lists. But we end with rocks, something stable, monotonous, slow. So the poem really dramatizes through its line breaks, overexcitement, and then a kind of calming down. And overexcitement over this kind of zest that can be found in poetry, but then slowing down to wonder, well, what does it all mean after all? And then the poem finally, I would say, protesting too much. It seems like at the very end, the poet is really stepping back from the energy of the first stanza and trying to convince himself that there is permanent meaning in this surprising, crazy world of kangaroos and aspirins. So there is an example of how line breaks can work to reinforce the meanings of a poem. And I hope my visual poem there was helpful to you.